Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Human Rights Day webinar. My name is Diane Clements Boyd, and I serve as the first Vice President of the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, and I am also Executive Director of the Evansville-Vanderbilt County Human Relations Commission. Before we proceed, please allow me to remind you to like IAOHRA on LinkedIn and Facebook and tag at hashtag IAOHRA. Today, we are excited to celebrate International Human Rights Day, which recognizes the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations in 1948. If you haven't already, we encourage you to read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in its entirety. When we protect the rights of all people, we are carrying out the mission of the Universal Declaration. Events like this promote justice and more equitable community. Now is the time to come together, support basic human dignity, and ensure that all people have the opportunities that were outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 75 years ago. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights remains the leading international guidepost for achieving freedom, equality, and justice for all. In the aftermath of World War II, on December 10th, 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. According to the United Nations Human Rights Office of High Commissioner, if there was ever a moment to rekindle the hope of human rights forever, it's now. Together, let's reinvigorate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, showing the ways it can meet the needs of our time and advance its promise. According to the ACLU, democracies around the world, including key U.S. allies, have independent bodies dedicated to monitoring and promoting human rights. But unfortunately, the United States is an outlier. Not a single domestic agency in the U.S. has the mandate to coordinate the implementation of our international human rights commitments. Therefore, we fall short of meeting international standards. We can bring human rights home to the United States by establishing a national human rights institution. Today, we are excited to introduce a group of international human rights experts and allies to discuss the critical need for a national human rights institution in the United States. Before we proceed, if you have questions during this presentation, please put them in the chat, and we will try and get to as many of them as possible. But now on to our presentations. The first presenter is Lisa Borton, Senior Policy Counsel at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Following Ms. Borton, you will hear from Dr. Elisa Warren, President of the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies. After Dr. Warren, you will hear from Dr. Rodrigo Corazzo, Ambassador and member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee. Lisa Borton is the Southern Poverty Law Center's Senior Policy Counsel for International Advocacy and a civil and human rights lawyer with more than 30 years of experience. She has represented death row prisoners in post-conviction litigation, prison conditions litigation, and representation of people experiencing homelessness or poverty. She is a graduate of the Emory University School of Law and the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. She oversees the Southern Poverty Law Center's work to advance U.S. implementation of its obligations under international human rights. And now we will turn it over to Ms. Lisa Borton.
Thank you so much, Diane. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to have this opportunity to talk with you today about the topic of national human rights institutions. In fact, I've been taking every opportunity I can get to speak about the importance of NHRIs and the need for such an entity in the United States, because like most things that concern human rights, not to be confused with civil rights, the vast majority of the people in the United States don't even know they exist or what they are, much less why they're important. So I suspect this is a particular audience that's starting from a more knowledgeable place than that. But just to be sure that we're all on the same page, I'd like to start by taking a few minutes to talk about what a national human rights institution is. The first thing to know is that there are many, many NHRIs in countries around the world. According to the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, more than 120 countries have an NHRI. A very basic definition of an NHRI is that it's a national level government agency or organization that has either a constitutional or a legislative mandate to promote and protect human rights. While an NHRI is created and funded by the government, though, it operates independently. It can carry out its mission to promote and protect human rights in a number of different ways. It can advise the government and assist it in meeting its international human rights obligations. It can monitor and report on implementation of human rights standards and the human rights situation in the country. It can act as a liaison on human rights issues between the national government and other governmental units, such as states, cities, and counties, such as organizations like yours. It can investigate complaints of human rights violations. It can provide education and training on human rights issues for government entities or for the public. It can cooperate with NHRIs in other countries and with international organizations like the UN. It can act as a think tank, conducting research and making legislative and policy proposals on human rights issues. Now, not all NHRIs undertake all of these functions, and they can be structured in a number of different ways. In many countries, especially in Latin America and Eastern Europe, national human rights institutions can take the form of an ombudsperson and that person's staff. Some are commissions, like the U.S. Civil Rights Commission that already exists, while others, particularly those that act as legislative institutes or centers. GONRI, the Global Alliance, accredits NHRIs based on a document that's called the Paris Principles. The Paris Principles were adopted by the UN General Assembly in the early 90s, and they have several core requirements for recognition of an NHRI. The NHRI has to operate independently and have independent control of its resources. It must have a broad mandate to protect all human rights. It can't be just targeted at certain human rights for certain groups. It must have adequate resources and powers. It must be pluralistic in its composition to look like the makeup of the country. It must be able to cooperate with other state institutions and with civil society organizations and individuals. And it must be able to engage with international bodies. Beyond those things, there's a lot of flexibility in how they can be put together. GONRI gives A-level accreditation to fully compliant NHRIs and B-level accreditation to those that are only partially compliant, but which it deems to satisfy enough of those core principles to deserve recognition. While, as I mentioned, there are more than 120 countries around the world that have established an NHRI, including most U.S. allies, the U.S. hasn't. To understand why, you really have to look more broadly at how the U.S. has treated international human rights, including its obligations under ratified treaties in general. You probably know that the U.S. played a major role in the establishment of the United Nations and the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Diane mentioned earlier. The UDHR is the foundation for all of the human rights treaties that came after it, but it's not itself a binding document. What you may not know is that the U.S. has only ratified 3 of the 9 core human rights treaties at the UN. Those are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the Convention Against Torture. The U.S. has not ratified, for example, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, although it has ratified 2 optional protocols under that treaty dealing with child soldiers and child sex trafficking. Hasn't ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, or the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. What you very likely don't know, unless you're an international human rights law junkie, is that even the treaties that the U.S. has ratified have gone unimplemented and are basically ignored beyond lip service. When ratifying those treaties, the U.S. declared them non-self-executing, meaning that they don't have the force of law in the U.S. unless and until Congress passes legislation to incorporate them in our domestic law, which it has never done. And no U.S. president, including the current one, has required any of these treaties to be incorporated in or implemented through domestic policy. A good example of this failure in the current administration is the 2 racial equity executive orders, which the president issued during his term so far, neither of which contains a single word about the U.S. obligations under the Treaty on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The second of those EOs actually came after the U.S. underwent a review by the UN committee that oversees that treaty in August of 22, at which the committee specifically criticized that omission. And after my organization and others raised it with the White House on numerous occasions. So it's not like it slipped their minds. They know that this is something that civil society organizations are pushing for. Except when they're scrambling around to get ready to answer questions at a UN review, which at best happens every 5 or 6 years, federal agencies generally don't know about, don't give a thought to what international human rights treaties require of them, much less how they could satisfy them. So that sounds like a good opportunity for training and education, right? U.S. officials usually have 2 blanket excuses for failure to implement human rights treaties. The first one is we already have domestic laws that do all the same things, so we really don't need to talk about the treaties. This is not accurate. A couple of quick examples of that. The Treaty on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination requires affirmative measures to address the continuing impacts of racial discrimination. Of course, affirmative action has been unlawful in this country for years, other than in higher education, and the Supreme Court has recently dispensed with that. The Convention Against Torture requires that torture be defined in law and criminalized. Congress actually has passed a law defining and criminalizing torture, but only when it takes place outside the territory of the United States. In other words, U.S. courts can prosecute a person for committing the crime of torture abroad, but not when there's no such crime that can be committed on U.S. soil. The U.S. claims that other existing laws deal with torture in the U.S., but again, that's not accurate. Under international law, for example, solitary confinement for more than 15 days or solitary confinement imposed on juveniles or people with mental illness is considered torture. But those things happen all day, every day in the United States, and there's no law under which the people who are doing it can be prosecuted. Okay, enough of my rant about the failure to implement human rights treaties. I think you can see from these examples, though, a number of ways in which an NHRI could be a real benefit. So where do we stand now with regard to the topic of a U.S. NHRI? Well, there have been various efforts by civil society organizations over the years to encourage the establishment of an NHRI. But over the last year and a half or so, a growing coalition of organizations have begun to build a serious campaign, one that I think you'll be invited to join before this program is over. Led by the ACLU and by SPLC and others, we are working to educate other civil society organizations, members of Congress, and the public about what an NHRI is and why the U.S. needs one so badly, and to increase the pressure from international bodies and from U.S. allies to start on the road to establishing one. So I'm going to talk about a number of resources that you might want to look at in more detail, and I'll be dropping some links to those in the chat in case you would like to take a look at them. As I mentioned, in August of 2022, the UN committee that oversees the compliance with the Treaty on Racial Discrimination conducted a review of the U.S. And along with several other organizations, SPLC included U.S. failure to establish an NHRI in our report as part of our overarching concern about the lack of treaty implementation. And in its final recommendation that were issued after the review, in December of 2022, the committee echoed that call for an NHRI. So in follow-up to that, in a letter to Susan Rice, who was then President Biden's domestic policy advisor, a large number of organizations urged the creation of a presidential commission to study the options for creating an NHRI and to issue a report recommending the appropriate structure for that within 1 year. And I'm going to give you a link to that letter. Let's see. Here we go. So the reason for that recommendation for the creation of a commission is that while there are other interim structures that the president could do through executive action, he cannot create an NHRI on his own. There needs to be legislation to do that. So this letter to Susan Rice was signed by about 90 civil and human rights organizations, as well as a long list of academics and human rights activists in their individual capacity. In March of 2023, 9 members of Congress sent a Dear Colleague letter to the president, basically asking for this same thing, for explaining why we need an NHRI and asking the president to establish this commission. And there's that letter from members of Congress. Now, that was through actually quite a lot of work by this coalition of organizations that we got 9 members of Congress to send this letter. So you can see there the need for education and outreach to members of Congress. So if you are persuaded that we need to work on getting an NHRI and you have those connections, we'd love for you to reach out to your members of Congress about this. So what we're hearing in conversation with people from the White House since these letters were sent, and we're actually working now on a new one that will go to Neera Tanden, who replaced Susan Rice in that Domestic Policy Council position. What we're hearing is not that there's any opposition at the White House to doing this, but that it's just not a priority because this is not something they're hearing from people about. Again, the lack of public awareness about human rights issues tends to be the biggest obstacle to their implementation. Squeaky wheel gets the grease, and there's not enough noise being made about these issues to bubble it up to the top of White House priorities. So we have continued to keep up the pressure. Most recently, the UN committee that oversees compliance with the ICCPR conducted its review of the US in October of 2023. A coalition of organizations joined IAOHRA in a report authored by the Northwestern University Program on Human Rights and the Economy that laid out the case for US NHRI in detail. And I think I have a link for that. Just a second. No, I'll have to look for, I will find the link for that and send it to you. But that was joined by a fairly large number of organizations as well. Also, the Human Rights Committee, which made that review, agreed, and again, in its recommendations, very strongly recommended for the U.S. to establish a national human rights institution. I also had the opportunity to speak at in October at the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe's Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights conference, which is a mouthful, in Warsaw, about this topic as well. So we are, again, trying to enlist as much international pressure as we can. In the meantime, though, while if we get a presidential commission, or while we're waiting for there to be a Congress that might be interested in establishing an NHRI, there are things that the White House can do to provide some infrastructure for implementing and monitoring human rights. That could take the form of an interagency working group, federal advisory committee that could include non-governmental advisors and people who work in state, city, or county human rights commissions would make great advisors on those issues, or the appointment of a White House official whose job it is to work toward implementation. Any of those steps would be a huge advancement from where we are now. Currently, there's not anyone in government whose job it is to work on implementing human rights treaties that the U.S. has promised to abide by. So I hope that I have given you enough information to convince you that we do need a national human rights institution in the US, or at least that you need to learn more about it. Soon there will be a campaign website, which we will share with everyone as soon as it goes live, which I hope will be sometime in December, where anybody will be able to join the campaign and learn more about the push for a US NHRI. In the meantime, in addition to the action that your agency can take, which I think Elisa is going to talk about, there is a petition that the ACLU is collecting signatures on, which I will also drop in the chat, that you can add your individual voice to, urging the White House to begin the process. And thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that presentation. And I do want to remind you to please put your questions in chat. And if you could limit them to questions germane to this webinar, and that being National Human Rights Day, and also the establishment of a National Human Rights Institution, that would be helpful as the presenters are prepared to answer questions in regards to those areas. So next we have Dr. Elisa Warren. Dr. Warren is president of the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies and works to unite, educate, and strengthen state and local government human rights agencies. She is also the executive director of the Missouri Commission on Human Rights, leading efforts to enforce anti-discrimination laws in the areas of employment, housing, and public accommodations. She has advocated for the Human Rights Treaty implementation before UN human rights bodies in Geneva, Switzerland. She holds a PhD in applied social sciences in community development and social disparities from the University of Missouri. She is dedicated to fight racism and bias and believes the strong partnerships are key to advancing social justice. Dr. Warren, thank you so much, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Diane. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed hearing my colleague Lisa Borden share more information about what an NHRI is. So thank you so much for that. And I just want to say that it's really an honor, a tremendous honor, to be the president of the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, which is a mouthful. It's known as IAOHRA. And we are the premier human rights professional leadership organization of state and local government agencies, and we serve nearly 250 million people in our member jurisdictions. And like in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, IAOHRA has been in existence for nearly 75 years. So we've been around a very, very long time. Our agency members are statutorily charged with enforcing the human rights laws, and they work to prevent discrimination, bias, and hate. Our mission really is to unite, to educate, and to strengthen state and local government human rights agencies. So you can understand why we are really very interested in promoting a national NHRI here in the United States, because it's dyed in the wool and the mission of IAOHRA. So in October, as Lisa did, in October of 2023, just a few weeks back, I was proud to be invited to represent IAOHRA at the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. And I joined the largest United States delegation ever before the UN Human Rights Committee at the 139th session for the consideration of the United States' fifth periodic report on the compliance for the International Covenant of the Civil and Political Rights, or the ICCPR, and several other civil society briefings and consultations. My contribution was primarily to advocate for the establishment of a national human rights institution here in the United States, similar to the 120 other democratic countries in the world. As Lisa has already described, NHRIs are charged with an independent national leadership role to promote, facilitate, and coordinate human rights implementation, and to provide support and guidance to state and local human rights commissions, which we definitely want to see more support. We do a lot of heavy lifting here in this country, and we need additional support. So this is something that we're very happy to get behind, and we hope that you will too. IAOHRA would like to see the United States take immediate action to establish an NHRI and to advance human rights at the state and local levels by providing meaningful education and support at all levels of government for human rights implementation. Democracies around the world, including key U.S. allies, have independent bodies dedicated to monitoring and promoting human rights. But sadly, as Lisa said before, the United States is an exception. We're an outlier in this area. Not a single federal agency has the mandate to coordinate the implementation of our international human rights obligations, our commitments, because we have fallen short of those international standards and those treaties that we've signed off on over 30 years ago, decades ago. There's no federal infrastructure in the United States to support human rights education, to support monitoring or implementation, nor is there a comprehensive approach to human rights that incorporates all levels of government. So consequently, state and local officials are often unaware of their obligations stemming from US ratified treaties. We just don't know what it is we're supposed to be aware of. That's why education is key. An NHRI would support unprecedented progress towards domestic implementation of key human rights treaties that were approved, as I said, over 30 years ago, and we have done nothing to make this happen. So multiple coalitions, and Lisa mentioned this, but it bears mentioning again, multiple coalitions have sent letters and reports to the US federal government urging the establishment of an NHRI. In December, just a year ago of 2022, more than 100 organizations sent a letter, and that was put in chat, to the White House Domestic Policy Council, supporting the creation of at least a commission to study the establishment of a US NHRI. During the most recent Committee on the Elimination of All Types of Racial Discrimination, or the CERD review, the United States NHRI was a central focus for IAOHRA. And additionally, last March, while we were at our board meeting in Washington, D.C., IAOHRA sent a letter, which will also be put in chat, to the president, to the Biden administration, and also to the U.S. Congress, outlining the critical need for an NHRI. And so that was even less than a year ago. But in the coming year, IAOHRA will be working closely with our colleagues around the world. We will host convenings that will delve deeper into the possibilities, and we can learn together how and what an NHRI can do. For example, it can promote and monitor the implementation of human rights obligations that so many people are unaware of. It can provide a public forum for the investigation of human rights violations. It can also create a platform for recommendations to provide human rights compliance. It can also establish mechanisms to advise and inform legislative, judicial, and executive branches on human rights standards, and to support and provide guidance to state and local human rights commissions. So a lot of good would come of it. Since the United Nations Human Rights Committee's fourth review, way back nearly 10 years ago in 2014, the US has made no progress towards establishing an NHRI. During those concluding observations, nearly a decade ago, the committees, during their fourth cycle of review, the committee indicated that, the Human Rights Committee indicated that we only have limited avenues to ensure that state and local governments respect and implement the covenant, and that its provisions have been declared to be non-self-executing, and Lisa mentioned this previously, at the time of ratification. So this is what they said 10 years ago. At that time, the committee recommended that the U.S. strengthen and expand existing mechanisms mandated to monitor implementation of human rights and provide them with the adequate human and financial resources to consider establishing an independent national human rights institution. More recently, just on November 3rd, 2023, in its concluding observations after the meetings in Geneva in October, the United Nations Human Rights Committee highlighted concerns over the lack of progress on the establishment of a US NHRI. The Human Rights Committee went on to reiterate the previous recommendations from nearly a decade ago, stating that the United States should establish an independent NHRI as a matter of priority. Let me repeat that, a matter of priority, of urgency, with a mandate to monitor and compliance with the provisions at the federal, state, and local and territorial levels. So, a first step, because clearly over the last 30 years, we've not taken any steps. So a first step could be the creation of a presidential commission to study the establishment of a human rights institution. The commission would be able to seek input from diverse civil society groups, including social justice and civil rights groups, from lawmakers, from experts, and others that will inform them on how an NHRI would best address the needs of our society and our nation. Representing IAOHRA to advocate for a U.S. NHRI on such an esteemed global platform was an essential step towards influencing the establishment of an independent NHRI here at home in the United States. IAOHRA remains optimistic that a U.S. NHRI will be established to amplify the voices of state and local and territorial human rights agencies at the national level. Attending the sessions in Geneva was a critical opportunity to bolster the global impact of IAOHRA through meaningful engagement with other international actors. These important connections provide a gateway to unite, to educate, and to strengthen human rights, as well as establish IAOHRA as a valuable resource on the international stage. I'm so proud of our IAOHRA member agencies who actively engage in enforcing anti-discrimination laws, as well as educating to protect the fundamental rights of which advance human rights principles every day. Our work is critical to giving international human rights meaning at the state, local, and tribal levels. IAOHRA will continue to advocate for the creation of an NHRI as a part of our unwavering commitment to bringing human rights home to the United States. So I have, on the next slide, included a few examples of how you might begin your own advocacy for an NHRI in the United States. For example, you can work within your own jurisdictions or your own organizations to get added on future letters that will be sent out under the National Human Rights Institute campaign that Lisa mentioned earlier. There will be other opportunities to get included in that letter of 100. It will be a growing letter, and your name, your city, your state, your county, your organization can be included on that letter. So we can begin to increase the groundswell of noise, if you will, to let the lawmakers know that this is something that we need in our communities. And you can be one of those organizations that are added onto that letter. That's an example on the left side. In the center is an example of an official proclamation that your city, county, or state could issue in support of an NHRI. Now, this proclamation is actually hot off the presses in the state of Missouri, but it's actually declaring December 10th, 2023 as Human Rights Day in Missouri by the governor of our state, where I do my work in the state of Missouri. So that has been done for over a decade in Missouri, and we've continued to push for that and make that known. And the next step could be a proclamation that would declare the need for an NHRI in the United States. Also, to the right, the document on the right is a sample resolution that you could use within your own municipality to adopt and promote the critical need for an NHRI in the United States. So those are 3 sample documents that are being dropped into the chat as well. And so let's urge the U.S. government to take bold action on human rights to demonstrate that our commitment to human rights starts right here at home. It's a once-in-a-generation opportunity to put the U.S. on a path towards compliance with international human rights obligations by establishing a federal commission to study the creation of an NHRI, and it would promote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in everyone's civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Warren. Now we will hear from Ambassador Rodrigo A. Corazzo. As permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Corazzo has been involved in the work of the Third Committee, Human Rights, and has chaired or been a member of numerous groups having an objective of respecting the human rights by women, children, older persons, HIV/AIDS, persons with disabilities, as well as many groups related to environmental and developmental issues. From 1993 to 1997, he was the first Defensor del Pueblo of Costa Rica, from where he promoted the creation of ombudsman agencies in Nicaragua, Panama, Peru, Bolivia, and the consolidation of entities in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. He has been the consultant for international governmental and intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations. A university professor, he holds a law degree from the University of Costa Rica and a PhD in political science and international relations from the University of Geneva in Switzerland. Thank you so much for being with us. Dr. Corazza, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very exciting for me to talk about human rights, but more exciting, let me tell you, that is a word I've been missing in the last approaches to this creation, and I hope that very short time of the National Institution for Human Rights in the United States. And what I have been missing is the term people, is the term individuals, is the term holders of those rights, is the terms of to show how this bold step may be taken in relation, in creating, in fostering, in strengthening the relation of the public system with the people who, after all, are those who have formed the nation, the state parties to human rights institutions that have gotten together in order to push for the respect for human rights on behalf of people all throughout the world. It was really very, very encouraging for me as a friend of the United States to see that huge delegation in Geneva in the month of October. Huge delegation of people striving for human rights, people striving for respect of those rights for the people in a very, very broad sense of issues from those of the most advanced technologies being imposed upon our privacy and our liberties to act, to the dire ones regarding people in persons in prison and persons in death row, or persons in what you call life sentences. I mean, very, very striking issues. And in between that, there was probably 40 or 50 issues that were brought forth to our attention of the Committee of Human Rights at the United Nations during those 3 or 4 years of interchange, basically with the organization of civil society. I mean, I was enthusiastic about it. I was moved by their presence one day and the other day and the other day in getting to us members of the committee driving those forces for the midwives or the midwives, how would you say, for the midwives practices according to the traditional use in the states of Hawaii or Alaska and other states of the United States, seeing our Latino kinship striving for their rights, the rights of the people. Very, very moving, and therefore kudos, congratulations for that role that very much impressed us. Together with the NGOs, there was the official delegation of the United States, which, as has been pointed out, was there to present the periodic report, the fourth periodic report, after the hiatus that meant the United States moving out of the human rights mechanisms of the United Nations in the last several years. So it was also a very hopeful coming back to that to those robes in which this type of issues are discussed and we pay attention. And there was one empty seat there, and one empty seat in the hall. Of course, you had to make accommodations for a secondary hall and a tertiary hall due to the size of the crowd, but the empty seat was that for the National Institution for Human Rights of the United States. The Human Rights Committee has provided in its rules of operation and the working methods that the human rights institution of each country presenting the report is there in the hall, in the middle of the hall, that the members of the committee should give attention, priority, time for the national institution to present also its report, presented in terms of supporting parts of the report of the official delegation, of pointing out the things that can be strengthened or improved, and of shortcomings in the respect of human rights. Again, for a person that feels very closely to the practices of the United States, which is my case. I mean, living in Costa Rica and working from Costa Rica, and having spent, I was making notes, 8 years of my life living in the United States, first as a high school student, and then as a college professor, and the final 4 as ambassador of Costa Rica to the United Nations. I mean, has gotten me very, very close to people in the United States, and to the quests of those people, and I feel very, very close to their needs for fulfilling those human rights. So that empty seat, that empty chair, meant a lot for me, very, very much. And so I moved, and we moved, and Dr. Warren and I, well, there's a picture there to attest it. We joined each other in the halls and spoke several times, and here I am. And here you are pushing for the creation of that national institution. The boldness is necessary to have that national institution created. When I was preparing notes for this presentation, I was wondering whether it was fair that I will be addressing you on the issue. I mean, whether it was objective, and of course it's not objective. I am passionate about this institution, about the possibilities that it brings, again, for the people and for the system of a country. I was blessed at age 44 in 1993 to be elected as the first ombudsman of Costa Rica for a 4-year period, elected by Congress according to a new law that had been mandated by Congress. And to be given, I have it here, just this is all that I was given at that time, not even a cent of a budget to push it forth. You say, "Lo, you go out and you do something with that piece of paper." And I got close to the people. I got close to civil society. Got close to media. I began going around. I began sensing the needs of the people. The people began coming to us. We began also going to other institutions, the seat of other institutions, to learn how they were acting and how they were processing such issues. And meanwhile, in Costa Rica, there was the belief that this institution was not necessary. People were writing in the newspaper, why another institution, more red tape and more bureaucracy and this and that. We only got up to 100 people altogether at the end of my term. Why have this institution if human rights are not violated in Costa Rica ever? Yes, of course, we have no army. There's no death sentence was abolished or annulled 140 years ago. Education is something dear to the country and so on. Of course, we have shortcomings in all of those issues, but according to these people, there was no need. Well, they were not there the first day that we opened 30 years ago in the month of October. Lines of people, 40,000 claims during the first year of our mission in the post. I don't know if I told Dr. Warren at that time that that there is a yearly survey in Costa Rica to all institutions that relate to people and the persons, official and semi-official institutions. And at the end of 4 years, our Defensoria, our Ombudsman Office, our national institution for the defense of human rights, was occupied the first place, both in perceived effectiveness by the people surveyed, as well as in trust. Of course, the Catholic Church was not very glad that we got that distinction. They were supposed to be the holders of the #1 position, and we were able to get so close to the people due to their natural tendency to get around the good issues. I mean, we're not fighting. We were just saying things as they were. We were putting persons to say what were their needs in terms of good education or sufficient alimentation or food, or in terms of taxation, for example, to make a fairer taxation system, and so on. Many issues we approached during that time. Mind you, in 1992, 1993, we also had to go out of our country to defend other human rights defenders, actually and literally as human shields of fellow ombudsmen in Honduras, in El Salvador, in Guatemala. Let's remember those dates of the 1980s and 1990s in those countries in which whoever claimed for the respect of human rights was immediately targeted as someone who had to be eliminated and so on. So we were in their support, and as was mentioned in the introduction, the kind of introduction you made of me, thank you very much, Diane. We had the impetus and the good success of being able to push for the creation of this national institution in Nicaragua, in Panama, in Bolivia, and in Peru, and to make a joint or a team of national institutions that was very, very strong in the time. Let me welcome the United States to this regional group of institutions, of national institutions. We'll have so much to share. We'll have so much to learn from the United States, but also the United States will have very, very much to learn from what we have accomplished. I made a couple of notes here that reflected some of those issues that that at that time it came close to my heart. This Defensoría de los Habitantes, Defensoría del Pueblo, Defender of the People, we call in Spanish, brings fresh air into a society, brings open windows to democracy. Somehow it turns the tide in the perception of the people. Let's just remember that the government offices, such as the head of a national institution or whoever works at the national institution, are in the government side, but we work on behalf of the people. We need that those people think that we are with our heads oriented towards those needs, that in countries such as Costa Rica and others in this region, of course, our needs, which are also always affected by the lack of sufficient resources, how to make those resources stretch so as to cover as many of those needs, and how to make needs progress. I mean, when we talk about economic, social and economic and cultural rights, it is in the theory that these rights are not written in stone, but that they improve from day to day. We could not believe that at that time in 1993, the right to interconnectivity would be a right for the people, less for the people of a developing country. Well, now it is through the efforts of some of this institution that has made it so that the rights evolve as much as the countries and the situation evolves. This institution, let me perhaps end by saying this, also brings about a new form of justice, an alternative form of justice. What was our favorite strategy when we went out in the street to meet people and to hear people voice their complaints or their needs or their aspiration? Well, our preferred strategy was to have our officer, especially when they went into small hamlets, take the person by the hand and walk to the local office, which was perceived as not fulfilling the aspirations of that person, and speak, the person the claimant, and the officer, the public officer, to find out how the ends could meet there. So this was a way of solving conflicts through alternative means, and not so much by writing and going into lifelong processes to have justice when it is frequently very late. So we push. I still push many years afterwards, and I'm very glad to dress up today, which is not my common uniform nowadays. To dress up for you and tell the IAOHRA, and tell the people in the United States that if somehow I can return the many good things that I learned while sharing with you there in helping or giving some ideas for this push into which you are, I will be obliged to do. And well, again, I hope that my enthusiasm comes forth in this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Carrazzo, for that presentation. And thank you to all of the presenters this afternoon. And hopefully you have been enlightened on the human rights framework and the importance of advocating for a national human rights institution in the United States. I can see that there are a few questions in the chat, and presenters, I hope that you can see those questions as well. But I'll just start off with one of the questions, and then we can just continue to go until we run out of time here. But this one says, it's hard to understand why the U.S. government resists establishing an NHRI since it would help U.S. human rights implementation. What are your theories as to why there is this resistance? Anyone that would like to answer that?
Well, I'd be glad to start. I think that part of it has to be credited to U.S. obsession with sovereignty. You know, this is the same reason that the U.S. declares treaties non-self-executing, the same reason that it is not a party to the International Criminal Court, that the U.S. rejects anything that it deems to be, you know, somehow treading on its sovereignty. And so even though it has ratified these treaties, it doesn't want to be in a position of being told what it must do to implement them. And I think there is a fear that, you know, an independent body would make findings about these failures that, while it wouldn't be able to enforce them, would be influential because it would be a U.S. institution. You know, the UN doesn't have any coercive power behind these treaties. It makes recommendations and reports, but it doesn't have any mechanism to enforce those. And that's the way the U.S. likes it. So I think there's an aspect of that. And also, you know, it's just going back to the fact that there currently is no mechanism, no infrastructure within the government for implementing these treaty obligations. If we create an institution that is designed to do that, that's going to be, you know, I think in a lot of people's minds, a lot of work for agencies to have to actually start implementing them. In my view, it actually might save them a lot of trouble and time if they had an organization that understood these obligations, that provided training and assistance, that collected the data and did the reporting for them. It could really be a great benefit. But I think one of our jobs here is to find ways to make agencies see how they can be benefited by the creation of a national human rights institution. You know, what's in it for them? That's something that, you know, our campaign is going to have to accomplish.
There's another question.
If I could add on to Lisa's comments, Diane, this is Elisa. I'm glad to hear her comment on that, because I think that's one of the biggest questions that I've heard. You know, well, why isn't it? You know, I'm seeing in the chat. Well, this is appalling. Our standing on the international stage, that the U.S. that chair is empty, that the ambassador spoke about, and we were actually ushered out of the room because the U.S. didn't have an NHRI, so we didn't get that opportunity to speak in that way. But I think one of the problems is likely a lack of awareness and understanding that we need to, as practitioners here in the US, help to educate our legislators, our lawmakers, our mayors, our governors, our the people who create policy in our jurisdictions, to educate them on what this is, what the need is, and how it can help. As Lisa said, it can actually, in the long run, be a very helpful tool, but I think it's a little scary when you don't understand it. You know, when it's something out there that the other folks in the world are doing, but we don't have to do that. There's nothing to see here. There's a lot of education that we have to do. And I think IAOHRA is well positioned to help in that regard, but I think everybody who cares about those particular rights and freedoms and equality in our country should care and be made aware of our standing on the global stage. So I think if I leave you with nothing else, I think that we really have got to educate people within this country. We just don't know what we don't know. And so that's a big part of what we'll be doing in the coming year. And I'll talk about that in closing too, but I think education is key. And so I would also say that.
I think that's a good segue to this next question, and that is, how does the lack of a U.S. NHRI affect U.S. standing internationally? How are we perceived on the national stage as a result of that lack of an organization?
Maybe we should ask the ambassador that. What does the rest of the world think of us, sir?
Yes. I was so glad on January 20th of 2021. I hope that you remember that date, which meant the hope for a big change. And the change began to operate. Let me not be fooled by the circumstance. Very timidly. The whole apparatus is very difficult to move, and still one sees those tendencies of the United States not to be told by the rest of the world, excuse me, on its fulfillment of the obligations to its people as understood by the rest of the world. We need to have the United States as an active player in human rights, in climate change, in the roads to peace, and so on. And yes, when we see that the empty chair, it is felt. It is felt and is not applauded.
Very good. There is another question. I believe this may, maybe Ambassador Carrazzo, this may be for you, but it says, of the three structures mentioned, Ombudsman, Commission, Policy Center, which one would be the easiest to implement first? And is that the direction approach we should take when trying to urge the U.S. to create an NHRI?
When the first question was approached, and why was there a resistance to create the national institution, I had my mind set on the system of the United States, the federal system of the United States, a federal government and state governments independent from the federal governments in most of the issues, and then even the local governments, with which I am not so familiar as with the other ones higher up in the hierarchy. But on reflecting on that federal organization of the United States, on the tendency of the United States through history and to having established a system that for more than 250 years, probably to the date, 240 years, has worked. I think it is the one-person institution. I was checking to find somewhere the meaning of the word SAR that is used in the United States whenever they pick up a person and tell them, all right, you are here, you come and you fix everything that needs to be fixed, and next day the media calls him or her the SAR of such an issue. So there's a natural tendency to recognize leadership of one person, who of course has to be surround herself or himself by the most intelligent and most able people in order to perform the job. So I think, and that's why I welcome the United States to be part of this regional system that exists in the countries of its sphere of influence, if I may use the word, going back to all the times. I mean, the countries of Central America, countries of South America, and go on to permeate the small island countries in the Caribbean. So be one of us, and as I said before, let's learn together. I think that I may go on, but it is a subjective perception of a mine. A commission gets diluted, many people infighting and so on, whereas a responsible one person led institution. This person has to work 20 hours a day, let me tell you. That's how much is necessary, with full enthusiasm, with much proximity to the people, to the media, and with a strong hand and in its relations with politicians, with those who are exercising power or office on the other side, who are the ones that need to change, that need to evolve.
Please.
I was just gonna say that's a really interesting perspective, because my inclination is that, given the size of the US and the diversity of the human rights issues that are faced, that a czar or an ombudsperson would be immediately overwhelmed by the responsibility. And I also tend to think that, especially in the political climate that we have now, where there's an unfortunate lack of trust, that it would be important to have a group of people who come from different backgrounds and perspectives, who can, represent the interests of different groups that have human rights concerns in the United States. Just like when we go to the UN, there are coalitions of indigenous people, there are coalitions of Black communities, there are coalitions of women, there are coalitions of people with disabilities. And I tend to place a lot of, I think, value on the pluralistic requirement of the Paris Principles, that these different perspectives be represented in the NHRI. So I lean towards something more like a commission, but I think that's why we want the president to appoint a study commission, so that all these things can be considered in detail.
Dr. Warren, would you like to comment on that question?
I think there's much to learn there, and I agree that a study commission is a great next step, so that we can really, identify what would be the best pathway forward for the United States, and just to keep our foot on the gas and to figure that out. And as you said, Ambassador, to learn together. How is it that we can get this accomplished? And what works for one country may not work what's best for the other countries. I know that there are strong NHRIs also, not only in Costa Rica, but in Australia. And there's several other countries that have very strong models. Even our neighboring countries of Canada and Mexico, we can look to them for examples of high functioning NHRIs. So they're out there. We're just not aware of them. So I think that the study is a great next step, so that we can really identify what's the best pathway forward. So without having that information, I would not venture a guess, but we are a very diverse country. So I think there would be a lot of organizations that would need to have a seat at the table, if you will.
Well, thank you everyone for all of the questions. And although we did not have the time to get to all of them, we are very appreciative of your questions, and we will, at some point recognize the questions that were asked here today. So again, thank you so much for all of the questions. And now at this time, I'm going to turn it over to IAOHRA President, Dr. Elisa Warren, for closing remarks.
Okay, well, the time has gone too quickly. Thank you, Diane. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I guess now it is afternoon in the Midwest. First, I really want to thank our very special guest speakers, Ambassador Rodrigo A. Carrazzo, and also Lisa Borden, for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us today. Just the first of many, I think, opportunities to work together. I'm excited about that. And as the United Nations Committee outlined in their latest concluding observations just last month in November, the U.S. should establish an independent NHRI as a matter of priority. And yes. Yes, as a matter of priority. And my friends, we should not be a bystander on this global stage. The United States should be in that chair. It should not be an empty chair. We should be there. And so we're going to work very hard to try and work towards providing information and educating, which is the mission of IAOHRA, to help support and lift up our state and local human rights commissions and relations commissions around the country, so that we have the knowledge to share to help move this needle forward in the United States. So we'll be working closely with our colleagues around the world. We'll be providing convenings to delve deeper into this issue. We're going to invite you to look on our website and our social media platforms to learn about upcoming dates and events that will be happening in the near future. Even in January, there will be some things happening. So please do visit our website at IAOHRA.org to visit our website and learn to find out when those dates are happening. Also, too, as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, we are more committed than ever in fostering an inclusive society to protect and respect the fundamental human rights of dignity and equality for all people. We support international human rights principles embodied in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights for 75 years. And I invite you to join us as we work together to build a strong human rights culture in the United States and beyond. So on that note, in closing, I'd like to challenge you to an IAOHRA 5-step call to action, which includes a couple of things. Well, 5 things, actually. So learn more, educate yourself, sign on to the National NHRA campaign. They will have a very, very informative website, as Lisa said, coming up soon. I think it will probably go live this month in December. So look for that. It's the National NHRI campaign. So there'll be opportunities to learn there, to read more there, to sign up for activities there. It will really be kind of the central location for information. So look for that coming soon. Stay in touch with IAOHRA. Download and distribute our flyer. I think that's put in the chat. If it's not, it's also up on the screen. Stay in touch with IAOHRA as we're going to continue this journey in the coming years, hopefully, not just next year, but ongoing, to help make this happen, to provide information and education. So you can join IAOHRA as an individual member. If you're not a member of a government agency that enforces the discrimination laws in your jurisdictions, you can still join as an individual member, and we would welcome individuals who are committed to equality and justice as a part of our team. Also, we invite you to like us and follow us on Facebook, as Diane said in the beginning, and connect and follow us on LinkedIn. And I believe that there is a QR code on the screen that you can hold your phone up to and get directed right to those web pages, those social media pages. That'll get you right there. And there were some questions, I think, on the chat right away that asked for those in the beginning. So my apologies, it's at the end, but you can still get there from here. So please do follow us and like us on Facebook and connect and follow on LinkedIn. There's always a lot of great information there. And also tell us what you're doing. What are you doing in your community to build a stronger human rights culture by tagging us at hashtag IAOHRA, which is hashtag IAOHRA. And put that in your social media platform. When I see great things happening all around across this country, and I do all the time, our sister agencies around the country are doing amazing work in this space. And so we want to promote that. We want to get that out there so that our fellow practitioners know what's going on. A lot of times there are virtual opportunities like this one that you can log into. So if you check that out, you can follow, you can see it on social media and see what's going on. We would welcome your participation. And with that being said, I want to thank you all for your time, your attention, your dedication, and we look forward to meeting with you again. Look for more opportunities like this next year, because this is not the end of this. We're going to help work this through together. So thank you so very much. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Lisa, for your time. Thank you, Diane, for being a gracious hostess. And we will see you soon. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Likewise, and thanks for all those who wrote in the chat, which I've read, and thanks for the regards from Snowy in Indiana, and from Hawaii inviting us. I have to invite you to come to Costa Rica, which is nice and sunny.
Oh yeah, sunny and 85 is what you said the other day.
Yes. It should be about
Perfect.
It does. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time today. Thank you, everyone.
Adios.
Bye.
Adios.